We are here to talk about simulating gameplay in literature. Now, once again, I am Robert V. Aldrich. This is T. Morris. We'll be joined by a friend of mine. I really should know his last name. I'll let him introduce him up when he comes up here.
He's a good friend.
He's a very good friend.
They've been friends for a long time.
Actually, we have been, but we are convention friends, which means that I will go for months at a time, never see him, and then when we pick up, it's brother,
yes.
kind of thing. And if you've been to more than one MAGFest, you know exactly what that is like. Yeah. You will see people that you have not seen for 10 months, and it's like you never left off. Anyway, so simulating gameplay in literature. How many of you are fan fiction writers? All right, so all of you who raised your hand, you are fan fiction writers. All of you who didn't raise your hand, I'm assuming you're liars. This is the first thing that we have to discuss here is going to be applicable, and we're going to be talking about this in the modality of fan fiction because that's usually where you're going to see this happen, where you're going to take something from gameplay, you're going to take a video game, and try to write a fan fiction for it. I am very pro fan fiction. I do not want to speak for you as far as...
I write fan fiction, so I podcast fan fiction for Pete's sake. So yeah, I'm good. So I'm good.
Fan fiction is a wonderful branch of the medium. God bless you, more power to you. But even if you're not writing fan fiction, even if you're wanting to take mechanics from games and bring them into original fiction, professional fiction, and whatnot, it is very easy to get caught up in the notion of taking the mechanics. You are still writing. All the constraints of good literature still remain. Whatever your other ambitions are, you are still writing a story, you are still writing a literary tale. So at the end of the day, you have to observe all the rules of good literature, or damn sure know what you're doing if you want to break them.
So there are two schools of thought when it comes to writing. One of these two schools you may have heard before, maybe you've heard both. And first thing I want to establish is that there are some authors that poo-poo fan fiction. This is a nasty aspect of insecurity from authors, because honestly, some of the best works and some of the most successful works, not necessarily the best, but some of the most successful works in literature have come from fan fiction. And that is something that authors don't want to admit, but it's true. And also, everybody starts somewhere. I started writing fan fiction, and from fan fiction, I became an author. And I'm still kind of looking at these bylines going, that didn't happen, but it did. But the two rules that you'll hear everybody talk about, one is show, don't tell. The other one you might hear is, well, as you know, Bob, and if you do, and does anybody, just show of hands, who doesn't know the as you know, Bob rule? Okay, so I'll give you a quick rundown on that. So we got two intrepid space travelers on an adventure, and I go, Jameson, what is that formation in front of us?
Well, as you know, Franklin, that is the famous Horsehead asteroid that brought forth the blah 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 blah.
And then it goes back to C rule 1, show don't tell. And that's the whole oeuvre of As You Know Bob, is that what they try to do to get around show don't tell is that they slip it into the dialogue. That's still telling. And when you start trying to translate game mechanics into literature, you suddenly find yourself going, how do I describe the triple jump of a hunter in Destiny? How do I describe Lara Croft driving her pickaxe into the side of a mountain while she's in mid-swing? You find yourself asking that, how do I? And then they try to slip in stuff with As You Know, Bob, but it's still telling. And that's going to be the biggest challenge you're going to find, is how do I show somebody the game mechanics that I've experienced?
Let me derail real fast here.
Sure.
You have an introduction to do, my friend. Who are you?
I'm Azareth Strife. Nice to meet everybody.
Accomplished storyteller, role player, fiction writer, and narrative networker. So, we talked about As You Know, Bob, and we talked about... Now, again, I just want to pay real quick lip service. Every rule you will ever hear about literature can be broken. There will always be exceptions. There will always be that one guy who got away with, that one woman who managed to do... That's fine, bless them. they were masters and they knew how to break the rules. Some people get lucky and break the rules in a way that still works. Don't trust in that, know the rules. Now, so, staying true to your source material is going to be a big issue when it comes to translating game mechanics because you're going from a specific game or a specific game genre. How do you do that? And that's going to be with representation. Going back to the description a little bit. One of the major challenges you're going to face is you're going to be going from a visual, interactive medium to a quasi-passive, depending on how much you yell at your book, literary medium. Now,
I'm sorry,
if
okay?
you find
I'm
yourself
sorry.
with a beloved character
I'm sorry.
that you kill halfway through the book.
I'm sorry.
Anyway.
Let it go, brother.
No!
Elsa
was
was
a
right.
charm.
Let it go. Let it frickin' go, man. All right.
Going from a video game to literature is going to be harder than going from, say, television or movies because of the active dynamic. With one of the things that makes video games so remarkable, so incredible, so amazing as a medium is the fact that you have a you are telling the story with the game, whereas television and movies, you are still sitting back and watching. These are things you're going to have to balance. The first thing anybody is going to be looking for when you are bringing mechanics from a game into a story is they're going to be looking for names, just getting the characters' names right. That sounds obvious, but if you write a Final Fantasy XII short story and you keep calling her Ashalia, there's going to be some friction there. Next are going to be descriptions. What does the character look like? If you describe Lara Croft as a blonde, you're going to have a problem. If you describe Kuros as a barbarian in loincloth, you're going to have a problem. I'm realizing the dead glares looking at me that some people didn't read the power novels of Nintendo's from the 1980s, and oh God, I'm old. So, you're also going to find yourself needing to explore the themes of the games, and this is where it starts to get very, very tricky. And that is, the theme of the game is not necessarily the genre of the game. Here is the classic example and what we're going to come back to time and time and time again. What is the theme of the Legend of Zelda series? I rest my case. Excellent, yes sir. You didn't raise your hand, whoever that was over here. Yes, sir. Exploration. Well done. Was that really your answer, or did you just copy her?
It was mine.
Okay, good man. Well done. Okay, excellent. The game, a lot of people will look at The Legend of Zelda and they will think, this should be Lord of the Rings. You have fairies, you have quasi-troll such things. But it's not Lord of the Rings. And if you were to read a Legend of Zelda story, it should not feel like Lord of the Rings, for more than one reason. But the issue with Legend of Zelda is the area back here, the little corners, the hidden passageways. That becomes the theme rather than the genre. The genre is fantasy. The nature of the tale is adventure. So, any questions? Any insights?
Oh.
Okay, good. Everybody's on board.
Okay. No,
Oh, okay.
no,
Go ahead.
no, what I would like to add to that is, along with translating all these different mechanics into literature, and it's also because we touched on this yesterday right before the panel, which was what do we define as mechanics? What is the definition of game mechanics? And yeah, you could easily say, well, if I hit X twice, that increases my jump range. Well, that is a jump mechanic. But is that a game mechanic? The game mechanic goes into other things. It goes into thematic messages. It goes into setting. It goes into lore. This is what we're using a much broader brush when we talk about game mechanics. For example, dovetailing off that, you said that Zelda is exploration. What is the theme of Lara Croft? Anyone?
Also.
So wait, it's right here. Stealing stuff. Try post-traumatic stress disorder. Look at Lara Croft at the beginning of it, and then look at Lara Croft just at the end of the Tomb Raider reboot. Just at the end of the Tomb Raider reboot, and then you see this. We constantly go back to this, the responsibility as well as the heaviness. It's a bit like, because I was talking about this earlier with my buddy Steve back there. If you really want to see a terrific study in post-traumatic stress disorder, play Lara Croft, play any of the Tomb Raider reboots, or watch Marvel's Punisher, because that is going to completely sideswipe you with this brilliant study in PTSD. That's one of the thematic things that when you're writing literature, it's a bit like when you have a chance to, it's the difference between a 2-hour movie versus a full-on series. A full-on series, you can explore character development, you can explore character depth, you can explore the inside narrative of what that character is going through. In literature, you have that luxury as well. And that's one of the things when we talk about game mechanics, we're not just talking about how the game itself works and how it translates. We're also looking at the storytelling behind the game, and we're also looking at the characters in the game, and we're looking at what they are dealing with. This all plays into game mechanics, correct?
Totally. Now we're transitioning a little bit from the general game's atmosphere into the characters. And here you're going to be balancing things like their motivations, their characteristics, their personality, and their idiosyncrasies. There's a lot of little things that you can find in the game that may not be immediately obvious. You made the mention of the double jump from that character from the game that I'm too old to be playing. You can get a lot of mileage out of taking those idiosyncrasies and working them into the character otherwise. The second Spider-Man series, the Amazing Spider-Man series with the very underrated Andrew Garfield, did a wonderful job with this, where they explored what would happen if you were bitten by a radioactive spider independent of the superpowers. Peter Parker started sleeping in the corners of his room. He started eating flies. He started hanging around on people and moving from chairs and climbing over things just nervously. This is a wonderful exploration of some of these side issues that would come from it. Going to, one of my favorite things is if you can take your characters to a restaurant, what do they order to drink? What sodas do they drink? Are they one of those annoying people that mix sodas because you do not put Mellow Yellow and Diet Coke in the same cup? That's just wrong. What's wrong with you?
That's weird.
I know it is, and yet there are people here who do it. In this room, you are in the presence of heathens. Anyway, moving on. So we get to talking about the themes, talking about the world. How realistic is the world? And understanding how it is similar to our world and how it is different from our world. If you're experienced as a writer, regardless of fan fiction, professionalism, or whatnot, you have the default, the real world accept, the real world untell. The assumption that everything that you know in the real world as it exists today is true until otherwise specified. Is that going to be the case? And if it's not, you need to set that up. If you are working with another world, very, very differently. Street Fighter. Who in here has played Street Fighter? Excellent. Everybody who didn't raise your hand, I'm trusting you are lying or you're one of those dirty Mortal Kombat people. Street Fighter. So Street Fighter has this pan-oceanic fighting tournament. How does that affect the rest of the world? Does the UFC exist? Do fighting games get covered on ESPN or do they get covered on the regular news? What kind of health insurance can fighters get? Do you have local fighting tournaments? White Wolf, the role-playing game company that made Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and others, actually created a role-playing game for Street Fighter that 9.5 people bought and played. But it explored this very concept of what would be a world where that is the penultimate or the ultimate sport that's going on. And so you decided you're going to take Street Fighter and you're going to take the Street Fighter mechanics and you're going to put them into the narrative. How do you envision Street Fighter? Because depending on the character you play, depends on the game. Chun-Li's story is very different from Cammy's story. Chun-Li's story is a police tale, whereas Cammy is a tale of personal revenge, which is different from Ryu, who isn't paying attention to a damn thing going on around him. Versus Ken, who is on a 9-year ego trip. Versus Zangief, which is a tale of state-sponsored optimism.
So to dovetail off that, we actually went through this, my wife and I, when Galileo Games approached us. We had a successful Kickstarter, and we funded what was called the Ministry Initiative, which is a role-playing game where you can be a secret agent in the world of the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences. It was so in fact the Kickstarter was so successful. The first edition for the role-playing game came from my daughter, who's sitting next to Steve. She said, "Can we play bad guys in this game?" Which led to the first expansion pack where you could be a double agent in the Ministry in the Ministry universe. But PJ Schneider was the writer of that, and we were consultants. And she came to us and she said, "We're doing a breakdown of the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences, its world, and its different branches. The one we don't know anything about is Antarctica. And that's when we realized, oh yeah, Antarctica was part of the British Empire. So we had to come up with, we had to fill in that blank. And by the end of the day, in a few glasses of adult beverages, we deduced that it was, that the Antarctica branch of the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences was was manned by 8 very large, rotund, bearded gentlemen and a Saint Bernard of an undetermined age named Bernard. And they were talking to Bernard, and Bernard talked back. I mean, it was, and that's the thing. When you're going from, and I don't know if we're staying on point or not, but the point is that
it's entertaining. That's what matters.
yeah, there we go. It works both ways. When you're going from RPG to literature, you're kind of bound by the rules of the RPG, and you've got to build on their lore and turn it into literature. Going the opposite direction, there may be some blanks you have to fill in. We didn't know about the Antarctica. We haven't had a short story set in there. We do now, because we had a very successful RPG that went with this very successful steampunk series, and the joy of that is that it's a process of discovery. Yes, you have a lore that you need to follow, both either from the established in literature or established in the IP, but that's intellectual property, by the way, just to make sure everybody knows. But there's still a sense of discovery because there is no real IP out there that has all the blanks figured out. It's like the Marvel multiverse. There's so many different possibilities, so many different things you can explore, and that's the joy of writing, is that process of exploration. So when you're going from literature to RPG, yeah, you may have to fill in some blanks as the author. And boy, is that a fun ride. That is so much fun to do.
To go forward with there, do you want to jump in here? Anything? No. Okay. To go forward with there, going back with the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences, each different branch, based off of the different continents, essentially,
right,
has a very, very different feel. So the British branch feels very different from the Australian and New Zealand branch.
Right.
And so you're going to have the same thing when you're talking about video games. Going back to Street Fighter, the different characters, their stories are going to feel differently. So how does 1970s Kung Fu movie feel compared to a 2000s Kung Fu movie? How is the 36 Chambers compared to the Matrix, compared to the Raid? They're all Kung Fu movies, but they feel very, very differently. So when you are thinking about your game, whether it's a video game or a tabletop game or whatnot, you need to not just think this is a fighting game, or this is an exploration game, or this is a platformer or what. You have to think about the very specific feel you want to create, because the Raid is totally, totally different than 36 Chambers, and yet they will be placed right next to each other in the blockbuster that I remember and nobody else does. So,
one quick tangent I think is worth mentioning. Yeah, when you're writing game mechanics for literature, or whether you always need to be aware of the IP. There are some gaming developers, and there are some studios and some houses that don't mind it when people write fan fiction around their properties. That's fine. There are some that are very territorial about it. They're like, we want to nip that stuff in the bud right now. That's fine too. The one thing you've got to remember before crossing that line is, am I going to give away this work and just put it up online as a podcast or as a blog or as a blog series and just have fun with it? That's fine. It's when you start saying, hey, I've just created this very cool fan fiction based around Destiny. Subscribe to my Patreon, and that's when you get the phone call. The phone call you don't want. That does not necessarily mean you can take your favorite game and not take its mechanics and then apply it to a work that you're writing. But you have to change. You have to change all the specific things to that IP. I am not a lawyer, but I'm just speaking from experience. If you cannot say, I've got this great game called Destiny in your work of fiction, and have it not be Destiny. It's got to be named something else. You've got to be very careful when writing around someone else's IP.
I'll get right to you in 1 second. I want to defend the companies that do this. As creators, it is very, very easy to say, to look at them whenever they swoop in and say, you can't write fan fiction for my IP and whatnot. It's very easy to say they're greedy, they're selfish, they don't want anybody playing in the playground. Intellectual copyright laws are very complicated. And sometimes they may not mind what you're doing, but if they don't challenge violations of their hold on a copyright, that can become very complicated to protect later things. Do not vilify an IP holder for protecting their IP. It may not be anything personal to them. They may even love what you do. Some writers love fan fiction, but professionally they feel obligated or are compelled to denounce it for legal reasons. So it's a lot more complicated than just fan fiction good, fan fiction bad. And I have created a lot of IPs, and if somebody writes in my world and they do a bad job of it, I'm going to take it personally. So it's more complicated than just good, bad. And so if somebody like sends you a cease and desist letter or something, try not to take it too personally, but respect the fact that this is technically their toys you're playing with. Now, I want to, you had a question, yes sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the memes are illegal panel, how they stated that basically all fan fiction is illegal.
No.
But if you, like you said, if you know the IP well enough, it's all about risk. Anything that you're doing is, there's a very low risk. If you know the IP well enough and what they're doing and whether or not they'll take it personally, then it's free form.
That's not, that is incorrect, at least when it comes to literature. It's more complicated in that it's not a matter of self-risk, and fan fiction is not illegal by default.
And I'll give you my own personal experience with it. We were actually told by our agent when so we've been, as you do in the modern internet stalking age, we track when people like mention the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences and things like that. We discovered that there was a forum that was doing an open role play with the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences. I thought it was insanely cool. I haven't read a word of it, and here's why. We didn't shut it down because it's like, that's cool. That's nice. It's really fun. But the reason why we didn't go down that rabbit hole and say you need to shut this down, or why somebody would say you need to shut this down, is because it's not just to, it's not necessarily ownership rules. It's also making sure that the authors are protected. Because our agent said, don't look at one word of what's happening in that forum, because if you come up with any sort of material or short story, novella, what have you, that resembles that, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. They're going to say, we came up with the idea first. So long as you show there is no digital footprint that takes you to that forum for a prolonged period of time, you're good. So it's not just to protect. It's not just to protect. It's not just to protect the property, but it's to protect the author as well. And there are people that have written fan fiction based off of the Ministry. I haven't read a word of it. There is also fan fiction, no, it's not, I take that back, it's not fan fiction. It's fiction written in the Ministry universe by other authors that we endorsed. But we also edited it. And we had to take some of these authors to task and say, okay, yeah, you know the Ministry well, you don't know as well as we do. And we have to fix this to make sure it fits in this universe. So when Rob says it is complicated, it is insane. It makes risk look like checkers. I mean, it's just, and there's a lot of nuances that you have to be aware of before you start playing in someone else's intellectual property. Case in point, I know for a fact that my free Destiny fiction probably strays far away from the lore that they have established at Bungie. Until Bungie says, you need to stop this, I'm still going to podcast it and have fun with it. But I know this is my take on the universe, and this is my love letter to Bungie for making such a great video game for me. But if they say to me, we are uncomfortable with the intellectual property, you need to shut it down, I got to honor that. And it's not necessarily out of greed. It is about protection of the authors involved, and it's about protection of their intellectual property. But yes, it is insanely complicated.
A couple of other things, like you mentioned about this is legal, this is not legal. When it comes to intellectual property, nothing is that clear cut. Years ago, I wrote the Crossworld series, which, part of the reason I'm at MAGFest, the characters used a type of magic where they simulated video game powers. I love video games, so I actually cited the video games in my books. You could actually recognize what game they were from. I had an appendix in the back where I said every single power on this page, it's from, Mega Man 3, it's from Final Fantasy. I consulted with a lawyer. That was legal. When I signed with my publisher, he was like, we are not touching Crossworld. What I did was legal when I did it. Is it still legal now? Maybe. Part of what makes the law is that it is fluid and it evolves with court cases. And it's not, this is legal, this is not legal. It is based off of current legal precedents, this is legal. But they could still, and then everything could change. So anytime you read somebody saying, this is legal, this is not legal, they are at best oversimplifying. Now, none of us up here are legal experts, right? You're not?
Nope.
None of us up here are legal experts. This isn't even a legal panel. We've gotten way off. So
I've watched a lot of Law and Order.
there we go. Yeah, there we go.
Dun, dun.
I've only watched SVU because of John Mulaney talking about Ice-T.
Ice-T.
But there we go. Let's go. So let's get back to the game mechanics. Yes, sir.
On that track, have you ever heard of the mechanics, aesthetics, dynamics research paper?
I have not.
Basically, it was on extra credits, but it was really a research paper, I think, done by MIT, but I'm not really sure. Basically, it outlines game mechanics, game aesthetics, which is on the player side, the dynamics in between, and one of the aesthetics is actually exploration, which we were talking about earlier.
I believe so. We're going to be talking about some of the stuff that Extra Credits had explored, which is the 4 types of gamers, and how that's going to influence how you depict game mechanics in your literature. That's actually a decent segue. Thank you very much for that, for stealing and hijacking the panel. Sure. The 4 types of gamers come in a lot of different terms. I prefer competitor, achiever, socialite, and explorer. You have, again, a whole variety of synonyms for these. And they're pretty well accepted in game theory these days. The competitor is the person who will stomp you in PvP. They have to have the best sword, they have to have the best armor, they have to have the best laser, they have to have the best haircut. Whatever the case is going to give them the advantage, they want to be on the top of the leaderboard. They don't care about the single player game, they don't care about exploring the entire realm, they don't care about having all the armor, they just want to win. God bless them, more power to them. They're also called psychopaths. Achievers want to have everything. They want the awards. They want the, what are those weird things they call on Xbox? Achievements, there we go. Achievements, there we go. I own a PS2, don't judge me. Then you have the socialite who is there for the guilds. They're there for the social dynamic. They want to trade the stuff. They want to do the things and interact, and they want the chat boards and all of that stuff. And they're really great. Somebody in here has met a significant other through that network, maybe more than one. And lastly, you have the explorer. They want the 100% cleared board. They don't want to just have found. They want to have one of every weapon, one of every shield, one of every armor. Don't judge me.
I'm not judging you.
That's way too much work.
Why am I friends with y'all? Those are generally 4 types of gamers. This is the audience that you are going to be looking at when you're trying to simulate your narrative. And when you're trying to take the gameplay that you play and put it in the game. Because all 4 of these hypothetical people are going to see the events differently. They're going to see the stage differently. A fine example of that would be, let's go to Lord of the Rings, heaven help us all, and Moria. The competitor is going to see kill the Balrog. The achiever is going to see kill the most orcs. The socialite is going to see read the book. The explorer is going to get the 100% clear page, including finding the hidden chamber with Balin's tomb.
Does that make Gandalf the competitor in that?
Of course it does. He hijacked it. If the entire party had worked together as one, but then he would have had to share the XP and he couldn't get the level up.
And on top of that, the explorer would make sure that Gandalf would die because that's part of the 100% rule.
There we go.
Gandalf has to die. Why is it a 95%? You saved Gandalf? You ass! Exactly. We got to see the cutscene.
There we go. And so when you are playing a game and you decide, hey, I want to write this Super Mario Brothers fanfic, may have God mercy on your soul. You need to think about what type of gamer are you and how are you going to write this in your mechanic. And who are you going to write it for? Because somebody's going to go, it's also worth noting, no one except true psychopaths are any one type of gamer. Everybody is a little bit, except for the psychopaths who are 100% competitors. And they're usually like 7-year-olds who live in Korea who completely beat you up and beat you out of that prowl card on Transformers Legends that you paid $50 to have all the unique. But
let it go. Let it go. Let it go.
I'm not. So, another thing that you often will not talk about in translating game mechanics is you'll talk about looking at an individual event and looking at an individual stage. How do you handle the progression? How do you handle the time between the stages? You have the time between the stages. You have the changing of enemies. Legend of Zelda, you have the moblins. Moblins come in 3 different colors traditionally. What does that mean in game? Are they smarter? Are they armed better? Do they smell better? Are their songs more interesting? But that's the game mechanic. What is Link's perspective of this changed fighting force? There's a lot that you can explore right there. In the Lord of the Rings movies, not the books, they explored this with the difference between the orcs and the goblins, and the orcs and the goblins and the Uruk-hai. Not well, but they did it. And so a whole world of fantasy has opened up recently exploring the vilification of orcs and goblins and whatnot. And that Lord of the Rings is a staggering genocidal tale of this oppressed people. Yeah, like if you read Lord of the Rings from the orc perspective,
It's very different.
wow, is Minas Tirith hell. Like, they're trying to liberate themselves from centuries of oppression, and Sauron is like the rising of Lenin, promising them they have farmland again.
It goes back to something that Tom Hiddleston said about playing Loki. He never played Loki as a villain. He played Loki as a hero.
It was
Because
just misunderstood.
it was misunderstood. It was a matter of perspective, and that's the thing is that in writing, this is the stuff you kind of explore, and where I think the trap, because I do think this needs to be addressed, but the trap of writing in video game mechanics is explaining every minute detail. I'm not going to name this one particular book by title. I'm not. But there was a book that came out, New York Times bestseller. People raved about it. Might have been made into a movie by Steven Spielberg. Might have made some serious bank at the box office based on nostalgia. I'm not going to name it. I'm just not. But the thing that insulted me the most when I read that book was it was a giant as you know, Bob. I was explained every little detail about this particular pop culture. I was explained every little detail about this popular movie from the 80s. I was explained. I didn't experience it. Now, The Jump, and one of the things that I think the movie, which will not be named, that they got right, spoiler alert, they were in The Shining. And you experience, you got it now? Everybody else got it, and the guy on the panel, they were in The Shining. And I really believe it was one of the best lines in the movie when the one gamer said to the NPC in The Shining, "Look, I'm all about skincare, and I totally get what you're going at, girl." Because that NPC was experiencing The Shining. They weren't being told what was happening in The Shining. And that is the difference between good writing and bad writing. And in the case of this panel, good writing of mechanics versus bad writing of mechanics. It should never be about telling you how a game works or how a character thinks. It should be about you experiencing what a character thinks or feels.
So going back to the villains in Legend of Zelda, going back to the moblins, like you were saying, the moblin with the red tunic instead of the blue tunic has better health and better, reach of weapons and whatnot. Cool, great. How does that translate into the real world? Has this dude gotten training? Has he been better fed? Is he just better slept? These are things you can explore in your narrative that will make it stronger. And the end result is the reader now has a better concept of why, when they replay the game, they're taking your explanation for this game mechanic, and they now have their replay value is enriched. You're gonna have the same thing with the atmosphere. When you go from stage to stage in one of the Lord of the Rings games, Lord help me, and Legend of Zelda games, the change in stage is often very abrupt, going from the water temple to the fire temple. Boom, it's abrupt. Take time when you're writing. Describe the water becoming acrid. Describe the temperature going up. There's so much that you can do that in the game you don't have the time for. In the literature, you can take just a paragraph and just talk about anybody who has ever studied water sciences and whatnot, hydrosciences, can talk about the differences between fresh water and salt water and how different that feels. Just that kind of detail can radically enrich the reader's perspective. So let's, this also leads into a little bit talking about non-gameplay mechanics. We talk about things like time of day. Some games now have that worked in, others do not. Talking about injuries. Gameplay, if you get injured, you just run through a heart and your health comes back up. What does that actually translate into? Final Fantasy games, if you're getting your ass whipped in the middle of a fight, you down a potion and you're fine. Well, what if you do that a bunch for like a whole day? Is that like eating nothing but protein bars and drinking Red Bulls? Because at a certain point, you will murder a hamburger.
It actually just forms an addiction.
What?
You get an addiction to potions.
And that's when the drinking problem began.
Exactly.
So Link actually just eat hearts.
This panel just took a very dark turn I wasn't prepared for. So, another thing that you can talk about is going to be translating the game genre mechanics to your literary mechanics. How many of you have played Mega Man? Don't raise your hand because I know the answer is all of you. And if it's not, I don't know what you're doing with your life. I really don't. Mega Man is a really, really colorful, zany game. Mega Man's just wacky, crazy. It's one step up from Looney Tunes. Your writing should reflect that. If you're writing Mega Man as RoboCop, you have made a very interesting literary choice. Not necessarily wrong, just boy howdy. Now, if you write Mega Man X as RoboCop, it's a little bit different. You were leaning forward. I don't know if you were going to chime in. No? Okay.
Mike's also.
So, gotcha. Well, you can still yell. I'm losing my voice over this. I still got to hawk books. Like it depends. My gas money depends on it. So, Castlevania games also work the same way. Different Castlevania games are a lot stricter and a lot tonally more horrific than others, but they'll have the same mechanic. Classic example is the disappearing blocks. The block appears, and then this block disappears, and this block appears, and this block disappears, right? Everybody knows what I'm talking about? You invented profanity at 3 a.m. Gesundheit. So, if you play that, if you have that mechanic in Mega Man, it's going to be really zany. You've got wild science. You can just have blocks disappearing and reappearing. Castlevania, you're going to have to describe that differently. You're going to have to come up with a stronger explanation for it. Everybody on board?
Yep.
Excellent, cool. Any questions?
Yep. We're good.
Yes, sir.
Couple. I'll just make this almost the same question, but for two different things. What do you think of the new Castlevania cartoon that's on Netflix?
It's
Good.
amazing.
All right. And on the same note, Ready Player One. What do you think of that?
Well,
We weren't naming that title.
1/3 of the panel has already made their opinions very clear.
Abundantly clear. I've never screamed so hard at a book, and I wasn't know what I was expecting. I was expecting the book to go, "Get off my case! I'm a New York Times bestseller!"
I heard him yell reading the book, and I live in another state.
Yeah. But again, to me, since you said the name, the biggest problem I had with Ready Player One is I was being told how awesome the 80s were. I wanted to experience how awesome the 80s were. And what I mean by that is that I wanted to get the author's perspective of what made it so awesome for him. But instead, I was told, this is why the 80s were awesome. This is why. And this is why. And you need to know this, this, and this. Otherwise, you're not a true nerd. And it came across extremely condescending, and it came across as being very, very, very forced. That is one person's opinion on a New York Times bestseller that was turned into a major blockbuster movie by Steven Spielberg, okay? Which means you can look at me, nod, and go, that guy's an ass, he's wrong. On that note, Die Hard is a Christmas movie. Fight me.
All right, all together, shield. Okay, believe that. Anyway, so when you're talking about the game mechanics, you need to keep in mind the tone of the story that you are telling, because the game will feel the same mechanic can feel very different depending on the game. Call of Duty will feel very different from one of the other not Call of Duty games. They're all the same. So yeah. Another thing that comes up a lot that a lot of writers can get tripped up on is when you are simulating game mechanics, do you describe the mechanic literally, or do you describe the atmosphere of the mechanic? Case in point, you got to the top of a Luckman stage. That game's 30 years old. Why am I citing it?
It's a comfort space.
Thank you. There we go.
Comfort space.
So I'm old. I just need to own it. Any game you're playing, the mechanic is not that big of a deal because you just need to press a button and get past it. What's so hard about that? Why is it so memorable? Because of the context in which it was happening, the stress under which it was occurring. If you climbed all the way up to the tower and had that disappearing block thing, the disappearing block is not a hard task to manage. What is hard to manage is your nerves, knowing you climbed all the way up the tower, and if you screw this up, you're going to fall down and have to do it all over again. So
here's another good example would be, what about what you were talking about, the tonal atmosphere. Okay, so let's go back to the game BioShock. Original BioShock. Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. So you go into you can, instead of telling me I stepped into the chamber, it was dark. I saw some light in the distance. Try it this way. When the door slid open, all I could hear was the pounding in my heart. The problem was my heart wasn't calming down. The smell of the place didn't help. That's something entirely different than from it's dark. And that's again, going back to the tonal aspect, that is the trap that some people think. They go, well, I played BioShock, what do I remember? It was dark. Well, what about let that imagination play. Okay, so it's dark. Well, what if you walk into a darkened room? Are you going to notice that it's dark, or are you going to notice there's a smell in the air? Because you know that underwater city did not smell good after all those decades of being down there by themselves. And I'm sorry, if you're walking around in a Big Daddy suit, there's going to be some funk coming out of that puppy. Some serious funk. And that's the thing. You go into the other senses and you explore that. That is what maintains the tone of a game that you're currently playing and trying to put into literature.
And one of the things that you can find is you can capture narrative momentum when you're creating this. This is what comes back to your PTSD point about Lara Croft and whatnot. If you can maintain a melody of emotion throughout your story. Case in point, you go into the dark room, going back to your example, and the door shuts behind you in the darkness, and you shriek. You can do that in every genre. You can go from everything from the manly startled shriek to the Three Stooges ah shriek and everything in between, and you can get a lot of mileage out of how you play that one tone. Going back to the individual obstacle though versus the feel, are you simulating jumping over the disappearing blocks, or are you simulating the exhaustion and the nerves of climbing that entire tower? What becomes more important? Because the individual obstacle may or may not translate very well. If you go into the dark room, going into BioShock, and you've got all the ruined world around you, if you can bring the sensations you have feeling that game into the description, you stop describing the game mechanics as events and you start describing the emotions that you are feeling. And that will carry so much more weight and strength with the reader than a block that blinks in and out.
And that would be my challenge to the writers in the room right now. The challenge to the writers in the room is don't focus so much on the game mechanics. Focus on what you felt when you went to I still remember when I first went into, BioShock Infinite, and I just going, my God, this is so beautiful, this is so beautiful, this is so beautiful. And I also remember that emotion when the biracial couple was presented on the stage and I was given a baseball. And I remember, I was like, I don't want to do this. This game is no longer fun. This game is freaking me out. And then it was just a rabbit hole. It was just a rabbit hole after that, a rabbit hole of madness, a rabbit hole of hatred, of toxicity, and I loved it. And I felt guilty about it, and I wanted to take a shower afterwards every time I played it. But that was the duality of BioShock Infinite. The original BioShock is just a straight up John Carpenter, good old fashioned Halloween movie. And again, I remember that terror I felt when I walked in and I saw this decay in front of me, this growing decay, and then the voices that I heard but I didn't see. F that, I want to play Skylanders again, okay? And that's what you should be doing as writers. Don't focus on the game mechanics. Focus on the emotion that the game mechanics you were playing evoked out of you, and get that across to your audience.
That is probably the single biggest thing to take away, is the game mechanics are the notes of the video game. The music that they play is your emotion. How many of you, well, we gotta move on real fast. I want to talk about that, but we don't really have time. So yeah.
Time flies when you're having fun at
It
MAGFest.
really, really does. Let's just open it up to some questions real fast. We've got about 10 minutes. Do we have any questions? Try to avoid picking on any particular properties. Ready Player One hater. Yes, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, so do you guys have an opinion on like the intersection of like narrative in games? Like I know we're talking about how to translate them into fan fiction, but in actual video games, I think that story gets kind of overlooked a lot. And I think that like a lot of stuff you guys are talking about is really valuable when you're writing strip literature or fan fiction. But do you guys think that there could be like more attention to detail about the story in games? Like what's your opinion on like?
As a writer that's desperate for paid writing work, I will say absolutely it could. I think video games would benefit. They would benefit from stepping out of the inferiority complex that they operate under. Video games live in a world where they're constantly trying to be either sports or movies, and they are neither. They are video games. Esports is a little bit different, don't hate on me. But, they need to own up to that again. Some of the best stories in video games were the result of letting the gameplay and the game dynamics decide and dictate the narrative rather than the other way around. And I think video games would do well to return to that. And they have, and when you start talking about like Steam and games like Undertale and such like that, there's plenty of that. That's just not the AAA thing, but that's also turning into a debate about AAA versus indie games. That's a whole nother discussion. But in general, yes, and I'm available if a game company wants to hire me.
On that note, there are also different ways of telling a video game story, both good and bad. Again, going on the negative, I think one trap that video game narrative falls under is throwing stuff at a wall and just seeing what sticks. It was my biggest sticking point with the Order 1886. And being a steampunk author, everyone said, "Oh, you're going to love the Order 1886." I hated it. I hated it because they were throwing everything at me. First, it was like, okay, we got the Bedlamites. Oh, okay, cool. We're gonna throw in werewolves. Okay. Oh, we're also throwing Jack the Ripper. Dude. And now we're going to throw in a vampire. Time the F out. This is not Van Helsing, okay? Let's just chill and tell me a good steampunk story. Versus an indie game that's out there right now that I cannot stress enough is a wonderful story of exploration. If you haven't tried it out, go to the indie section. There's a game called Soul, S-O-L-E. You are a ball of light, and you are awakening a darkened world. And it is mesmerizing. Steve and I have not shut up about this game since we tried it out yesterday. And it is an absolute delight to play, and the story just sort of evolves with you. I do think the trap of video games is they're trying to do it like a movie. The problem is they're trying to fill hours of content. So instead of trying to be like a movie, they should probably try to be more like a season. And I think you're starting to see that now. They're starting to treat, video games are starting to treat their storytelling like seasons of a television show.
Yeah, like the Telltale games. And
Right. For example, the one I've been citing all day, Bungie, we're in season 5 of Destiny. Season 1 sucked. I'm just gonna be the first one to say it.
it did.
It did. It sucked hard because of reasons. But man, they brought it back during the Taken King. They brought it way back on track with Rise of Iron. They missed a step on a couple of the things that followed, but Forsaken, wow, back to form. And the thing was, they focused on the story for that season. And I think that's something that more video games should think about.
Okay. We're going to close it. Yeah, okay, real fast, super fast.
It's not a real fast one. So.
Then never mind. You get come up
She had
after
a-
the
she had a
real fast,
question.
real fast,
No,
real fast.
no,
I
fast.
think incorporate the ideas of multiple choices or branching paths into a linear story.
Don't bother. Have your characters make a decision like they were playing the game, and then go back and rewrite your story 10 years later and go the other direction. All right, I would love to. We don't have time. We've got to run on. I want to thank everybody for coming. The closing statement that we need to go back to is the beginning one, which is you are writing. This is literature. All the rules of good literature are applied. If it does not facilitate a good story, then you need to strongly consider how much you really need it. If you focus on the emotions you felt during the gameplay, not the actual necessities as it was happening, then you will find a way to recapture that experience. I want to thank my panelists here.
Azure Strife.
Morris.
I'm Robert Aldrich. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of MAGFest.